Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this Christian Science lecture, sponsored by the First Church of Christ Scientist in Thousand Oaks, California. My name is Phillip Hockley. I'll be your lecturer today. The title of the lecture is A New View of God and Its Effect on Well-Being. This lecture is going to cover topics not just related to personal well-being, but also the well-being of the society that we live in. We're living in very pressing times at the moment, not just politically as we approach the coming election, but we're living in times of incredible challenges from the environment, from the health challenge of the pandemic, and the economic knock-on effect of that. So the ideas that I'll be sharing with you today will be equally applicable to those kind of challenges as well. And if you'll just stay with me for the next hour, I'll do my very best to explain to you not just how these ideas work in the larger field, but how they worked in my life to bring about a remarkable healing of lifelong disabilities. So as I said, I'm giving this lecture primarily because I myself came to a lecture like this 20 years ago. At the time, I was registered as permanently physically handicapped. And normally when I'm allowed to travel around the country, I would usually bring this certificate with me, which was issued to me by the British government. And it basically says, under the National Assistance Act of 1948, the registration of physically handicapped persons. And then it goes on to give all of my details. And those handicaps that I had were not insignificant. I had one leg shorter than the other from an episode of arthritis as a child. That in turn caused a scoliosis in the spine. That scoliosis caused my neck to be out of position for many years, forcing me to sometimes have to wear a neck brace to prevent it from dislocating very painfully. So those are the kind of hidden challenges that I had within me. But by far the most serious challenge on the night of the lecture was a weight loss issue that I was struggling with. I had not been able to absorb food for just under a decade because of multiple food allergies. And what this meant was, on the night of the lecture, I was grossly underweight. My usual body weight as an adult is about 185 pounds. At the time of the lecture, I was 105 pounds. So this was by far the most serious challenge I was facing at that time. So when I came to the lecture, I'd been told by the doctors already that in their opinion, all of the medical opinions said the same thing: incurable and likely to die from malnourishment. I then took that news from the doctors and used it to fuel a desire to find healing in alternative therapies. And it drove me to explore everything, literally from A to Z, from acupuncture all the way through to zone therapy and everything in between. Unfortunately, I still wasn't benefited by any of them. So then in my sheer desperation, I even reached out to some Christian churches in my region. Now, I say sheer desperation on purpose because as a young boy, I'd had a particularly painful experience at the hands of people who, in my village, they called themselves Christians. So ever since then, I just thought all Christians were nasty. So I'd had this lifelong aversion to people that called themselves Christians. But here I was facing what looked like a certain early grave. I thought I'd give them a chance. I rang all the churches. They all prayed for me in different ways. Nothing helped. So now at this point, it looks like I've got no human hope whatsoever. And so I decided to practice what I was promised as a mindfulness technique to help me die at peace. And so I was practicing this mindfulness technique for a couple of years before the night of the lecture. And what it does basically was it allows me to be aware of all the pain and suffering in the body, but not to react to it mentally, a kind of mental detachment. So the body was still in a lot of distress, but my mind was undisturbed. And so I felt a definite increase in my mental peace, even though my body was still getting weaker and sicker. And that was the condition I was in when I came to the lecture that night. I come to the venue and I sit right in the front row, and I'm in excruciating pain from the short walk from my home to the venue. My limbs are swollen, and I'm really just trying to focus on this meditation technique, not to react to all the pain. When everybody starts clapping and marked the start of the lecturer walked out on stage, and within moments of her opening her mouth, my heart sank, because she described that evening's event as being based on God's great laws of love for all mankind as found in the Bible. And I thought to myself, oh my goodness, they're Christians. I really didn't want to be there then. She then started reading from the Bible, and things did not get any better, I must say. She read from the first book of the Bible, Genesis. This is what she said. God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him, male and female created he them. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. Really, I was thinking to myself, very good. Yes, I'm in my mid-30s, and I'm almost certainly not going to make it into my 40s. I've had over a decade of constant weight loss, pain, and discomfort. I've had all of these challenges which stopped me being able to work, then being able to socialize, and now I'm in pain day and night, registered as permanently handicapped, and this lady wants me to accept that God sees all of this and says it's very good. This started to confirm my earlier opinion that Christians were just completely crazy and out of touch with reality. So now I've got no interest in anything this lady might have to say, and I actually just want to get up and leave the room, but rather depressingly, I can't move because the swelling and the inflammation in my lower limbs was too great. I knew I'd have to sit there for about 15 minutes to let that swelling go down. Then I could get up and storm out, I thought. But now I've got no interest in anything this lady might have to say. Or so I thought, because just the next few moments, something else grabbed my attention. And again, not in a good way. The ideas came from this book, Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures, written by an American lady called Mary Baker Eddy. Now, if you've never heard of this book before, neither had I on the night of the lecture, and yet the ideas contained within it had a life-changing effect on me. Let me just share with you, if you don't mind, that idea that I found so controversial when I first heard it. God is at once the center and circumference of being. God is at once the center and circumference of being. Now, when I say this grabbed my attention, but not in a good way, what I mean to say is I flew into a rage. I mean, my mind became so agitated. I was so angry that this lady would try to get me to accept that God is the center and circumference, as I understood it at that time, of this diseased, disabled body. Now I was absolutely furious. And in this moment of real rage and anger, I started to notice something else grab my attention. But this time it was in a really good way. And it played out like this. I'm sitting there in the front row. I'm in terrible pain from the walk to the venue. I've just found out the room is full of probably Christians, so I'm not happy. And then this lady is saying things, sharing ideas, which I find very provocative. So my human mind is full of anger and ill will, when I started to notice something else in my thinking, which seemed to be a little bit like an opening up of a roof. If you imagine, for instance, today, 4 walls in this room and a roof, a limited space confined to this room. If you imagine just opening up the roof on a clear, blue, sunny day, imagine then the difference between that amount of space above this room compared to the limited space within the 4 walls and the roof. The difference would be quite remarkable, wouldn't it? This is how it started to feel in my thinking. There was this human anger and ill will, but something seemed like it was opening up to reveal a larger sense of my own thinking than I had ever experienced before in my life. And as I was exploring it, I noticed a tremendous sense of feeling peaceful and then an accompanying sense of being loved. Now, when I say being loved, I'm not talking about the kind of love that had been freely exchanged with me by my family, my friends, my girlfriends. It wasn't on that level at all. This love felt like it was pressing in on every inch of my body. I was asked after the lecture to describe it. I used the term oceanic because it felt like I'd been dropped into a deep ocean. And in that deep ocean, the water pressure would be pressing in on every inch of my body. Well, that's how that love felt. It felt like the love was pressing in on me. While I'm experiencing this incredible experience, the memory then, what came to mind was, don't forget to pass your awareness through the body, not reacting. So that's what I did. I returned to that meditation. I was passing my awareness through the body. And the next remarkable thing came to my attention. As I'm looking through the body, all the disease, the discomfort, the stiffness, the pain that I'd brought with me to the lecture, it was slowly softening, loosening, and eventually just evaporating right before my very eyes. In fact, it was just like the way that an ice cube would respond if you took it from the freezer compartment and placed it on a warm, sunny windowsill, yes? Let the sun do its work. You'd notice that all the sharp corners would soften. Then it would become a puddle. Leave it long enough, the whole thing would evaporate, yes? That's the nature of an ice cube on a warm, sunny windowsill. As I was passing my awareness through the body, the same thing was happening to the stiffness, the pain, and the inflammation. It was softening, loosening, and completely evaporating right before my very eyes. And now I find myself in a completely sensationless body for the first time in my life. And I'm completely blown away by this until people start clapping to mark the end of the hour's lecture. And I hadn't listened to a blessed word she'd said. I was so absorbed with what was going on inside me, I actually felt very destabilized in that moment. And I just wanted to leave the venue as quickly as possible without making eye contact, in case I got involved in a conversation and I might say something, daft. So I made a beeline for the exit. And as I was leaving the venue, that church was giving away copies of this book, Science and Health, with Key to the Scriptures. Now, because I'm not there in the venue today giving a lecture, it doesn't mean you can't get a copy of this book either, because after this lecture, you'll see an information screen come up. You'll be given an email address that you can contact so that you can be hooked up with a copy of this book if you're interested. That'll come up at the end of the lecture. But for now, I'm having to leave this venue. And as I'm walking away from this venue, I'm noticing I'm taking long, effortless, pain-free strides. I'm breathing deeply and I'm standing upright. And as I'm walking away, I'm thinking to myself, what on earth just happened back there? And as clear as a bell in my own thinking, I heard these words. Philip, it was just like when you stopped believing in monsters under the bed. Now, I found that really puzzling because at the time of the lecture, I'm in my mid-30s. I hadn't believed in monsters under the bed since I was about 5 years of age. But then I was transported back in time and I remembered, because it was a particularly painful couple of months for this little boy. I remembered that I just started having these night dreams and terrors about a monster. I would wake up in the middle of the night, desperately needing to use the bathroom, too afraid to place my feet on the floor in case that monster grabbed my legs. I'd end up sitting there and wetting myself. This went on night after night, week after week, until I developed a terrible case of diaper rash all the way down the inside of my thighs. This started showing below my school shorts. So during the day, the boys in school started mocking me and bullying me. The teachers were not very happy because I was tired and tetchy in school because I wasn't sleeping properly. So the daytimes were not pleasant for that couple of months. The night times were pure terror. I remember every time I went into that bedroom, it felt like a crushing grip of fear had me. Until one eventful night. I remember I woke up desperately needing to go to the bathroom, too afraid to place my feet on the floor in case that monster grabbed my legs. And I'm just about to accept, oh, here we go again, when I heard these words very clearly in my own thinking say, Philip, why don't you just look under the bed? I didn't hesitate. I looked under the bed and saw nothing. There was no monster living under my bed. It felt like that crushing grip that had me for those couple of months was released in that instant. You know the way that a dish sponge operates? You squeeze a dish sponge and it's all out of shape. You release the grip and it just pops back into shape, doesn't it? I literally felt like this happy little chappie before this episode started this terrible period of night terrors and this crushing fear. And then on that eventful night, that crushing grip was released and I just popped back into being a happy little chappie. I toddled off to the bathroom. I came back and I slept soundly from that night on. Now, fast forward 30 years. I'm now leaving my first ever Christian Science lecture. I entered it as a disabled person in terrible pain and discomfort. I leave it an hour later feeling completely sensationless and free. I'm asking for an answer to what is so puzzling to me at the time. And the answer I get is, it's just like when you stopped believing in monsters under the bed. Puzzling as that was at first examination, as I continue to walk home, the similarities between that little 5-year-old boy's experience and this 35-year-old's experience at the lecture started to dawn on me. Because in the years leading up to this lecture, I'd been a very healthy and active, sporty kind of person for many years. And then all of these diseases started having more and more crippling effects on me. The doctors' opinions, all of them said the same thing, that not only are you permanently handicapped, inoperable, but lately they were starting to say, if you don't start absorbing food, in our opinion, you're going to die from malnourishment. These medical opinions became a crushing burden on this otherwise happy and healthy young man. And yet, as I'm leaving the lecture, it felt like that crushing grip had been released. The very next morning, not only were my legs the same length, my spine was straight, and my neck has been free from that day to this, but I was able to start absorbing normal food for the first time in almost a decade. Within 4 weeks of the lecture, I regained those lost 80 pounds. No special diet and no special exercise. It literally felt like I just popped back into shape, just like the dish sponge. Now, as a lifelong atheist, you can bet I had a lot of questions for that little church that sponsored that lecture. And so I made my way over to what's called the Christian Science Reading Room. Now, presently, with a lot of lockdown orders in place in different parts of the country and different parts of the world, the churches of Christian Science around the world are sometimes forced into operating their reading rooms online. So after this lecture, if you're interested in finding a local reading room that's close to your area, again, we'll be able to hook you up with a directory that can show you what reading room facilities there are in a town or a city near you. But at that time, I could go to the reading room and visit, and I did. And the first thing I wanted to know was, after all these years of searching for healing, how comes I'd never heard of Christian Science as being a healing church? And how comes I'd never heard of the lady that discovered it, Mary Baker Eddy? So they gave me copies of biographies about Mrs. Eddy's life. And I started reading about her life. And within just a few pages, I started to notice some themes which continued throughout her early life. The first one was born in the early 1800s in the New England area of America. She was born into a deeply religious family. She studied the Bible almost on a daily basis, often just opening the book at random and seeing what message the pages might have for her, as if it was God's inspiration to support her that day. So she loved working and studying her Bible throughout her young life. I also noticed she spent long periods for the whole of her young life very, very sick and poorly. She struggled with many normal activities, was often unable to go to school because of her ill health. And she, like myself and some of you listening to this today, she tried every known healing method of her day, still was not helped. Then, in the winter of 1866, Mrs. Eddy's life took a very serious turn for the worse. She slipped on an icy pavement that winter, so badly injuring herself in the fall that everybody in attendance, including a local medical doctor, were convinced that, in their opinion, these injuries were going to be fatal. She would not recover from them. In this deep, dark hour, Mrs. Eddy asks for a copy of the Bible to be brought. Nothing new in that, because she'd lived in close contact with the Bible all her life. She then says that she opened the Bible at random to see if there was any comfort she could find from her love of God, the love of the Bible, her love of the healing ministry of Christ Jesus. Could anything please support her? She opened the Bible at random. It fell open to the account of a man that had disabilities, came in contact with Christ Jesus, and was healed immediately. Mrs. Eddy says that she knew that healing testimony really well because she'd studied it many times before. But on this occasion, she was probably yearning more and more deeply to try and find some crumbs of comfort from her love of the scriptures, when she said she started to notice an increasing sense of the presence of love in that room. Now, she was alone in this room, so she reasoned that it didn't have any human source. But she said she started to feel such an increasing sense of love that she suddenly rose up well. She dressed herself. She went into the next room to tell everybody in attendance, not only was she well, but she felt that she now knew how to make other people well also. She then spent the next few years deeply studying the scriptures to see if there were any rules or principles or laws that could support that remarkable experience she had on that night. The end of those few years of searching the scriptures resulted in the first copy of this book, Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures. Everything Mrs. Eddy was writing about in this book, she found its source in the Bible first. So Mrs. Eddy did not invent this stuff. She didn't make this stuff up. She found the source of this stuff in the Bible promises. Then she started writing about it and experimenting for herself to see if those healing results could be replicated. This is just one example of some of the laws that Mrs. Eddy was basing her discovery on. It's from the book of Hebrews. I will put my laws into their hearts, and in their minds will I write them. So this is God now saying, I will put my laws into their hearts, and in their minds will I write them. In Mrs. Eddy's own words, she said this: I learned these truths in divine science, that all real being is in God, the divine mind, and that life, truth, and love are all powerful and ever present, that the opposite of truth, called error, sin, sickness, disease, death, is the false testimony of false material sense. Now, these material senses that Mrs. Eddy was referring to, they're the same 5 material senses that informed all of these medical experts that, in their opinion, this person in front of you is permanently physically handicapped. The same 5 material senses that informed Mrs. Eddy's attendees, including the local doctor, that she was fatally injured by that fall. Those 5 material senses Mrs. Eddy is here calling false testimony of false material sense. She then goes on to introduce a concept, spiritual sense. And this is what she says about it. Spiritual sense is a conscious, constant capacity to understand God. Spiritual sense is a conscious, constant capacity to understand God. Now, when I first read this, I read this in what's called the Christian Science Bible lesson. It's a weekly production from the church, which gives you a couple of passages on one side of the page about the Bible, from the Bible, and then a couple of quotes from Science and Health with its key to those scriptures. So I was learning a little bit about the Bible and then a little bit about how to apply that in my daily life. This is what the weekly Bible lesson is from the Christian Science Church. So as I'm reading this in a Bible lesson, spiritual sense is a conscious, constant capacity to understand God. It reminded me of the way that my physics teacher explained radio waves to me when I was a teenager, because the physics teacher used similar words. He said, I'm going to explain something that you've been living in and moving in, he said, but you've not been conscious of it. He was talking about the radio waves. So in just the same way, while I've been talking now, this room that I'm standing in, through every brick and beam of the building, radio waves have been passing, completely undetected by my 5 physical senses. The material senses are not aware of it. It seems like there's no radio waves here. But look what happens when I switch this on. If I switch this on, you can tell clearly that although my 5 material senses are not conscious of it, this radio broadcast is certainly here, isn't it? Then my physics teacher showed me a more important part to this lesson. The physics teacher then buried the antenna in his fist and did this. This now is proving that these radio waves are even passing through every fiber of my body, completely undetected by my 5 material senses. So what I was learning was, because the 5 material senses are not conscious of something, it doesn't mean that that thing is not there, does it? It just means that we are not conscious of it. So what I was realizing was Mrs. Eddy was telling us that with this spiritual sense, we have a way to tune in, if you like, to something that is higher than what the 5 material senses may be telling us. And what was she referring to that could be higher than what the 5 material senses are telling us? What is this spiritual sense that Mrs. Eddy was talking about? Well, one of the ways that it's described in the Bible is the way that Jesus demonstrated this Christly love for all mankind. Mrs. Eddy was starting to think that her studies of the Bible, she knew a lot about the love that was demonstrated at the time of Jesus' healings. She said because of that experience, that new view, if you like, of God as love, because God is described as love in the first book of John, Mrs. Eddy, experienced that love flooding her consciousness. She gets a new view of God in the presence of the power of love, and she suddenly rises up well. She was responding to this law of God, this law of love, which had been promised throughout the Bible. These laws are just like the laws of mathematics. The laws of mathematics don't come and go. A law means that it's constant. For instance, 2 + 2 = 4 today, yes? That means 1,000 years ago, 2 + 2 would have made 4. And in another 1,000 years' time, 2 + 2 will still make 4, yes? This is what a law looks like. Mrs. Eddy was discovering that all of those Bible laws, all of those laws that were promised, prophesied, then produced in the life and times of Christ Jesus, they seem to be forgotten for maybe 1900 years. But what Mrs. Eddy experienced in 1866, she discovered that those laws were still fully present and fully operational. That new view of God as the presence of the law of love completely transformed her well-being. Now she starts learning that she can pray this way, not just for herself, but for others. And prayer in Christian Science is more to do with quietening the 5 material senses and tuning in to what our spiritual sense may be able to tell us. Spiritual sense is a conscious, constant capacity to understand God. And why would we need to understand God, I thought? Well, in another weekly Bible lesson I was reading, in him, God, we live and move and have our being. Just like we're living and moving and having our being right now today in these radio broadcasts. Even though the 5 material senses may not be conscious of it, it doesn't mean that these broadcasts are not there. Listen, it's still there. It hasn't gone anywhere. And this shows me that if something is based on a law, that law is ever present and unconditional. Like these radio waves, for instance, they don't care whether I'm young or old or rich or poor, male or female. These radio waves are just passing through every brick and beam of this building. They're passing through every fiber of my body, completely undetected, yes, by my material senses, but they are there, passing through. These radio waves are passing through unconditionally because they're based on a law. Well, if these radio waves can be here unconditionally, how much more can the laws of God be present here unconditionally? This became a very thrilling experience for me to discover that Mrs. Eddy's works and the church that she formed to spread these messages and these lessons was based on the Christly love that Mrs. Eddy experienced for herself. She discovered its source in the Bible. Then she was able to teach how to pray this way for yourself and experience this Christly experience, this Christly healing for yourself. Mrs. Eddy was basing it again on Bible promises. There's one Bible quote which came from a letter to Paul. He says very clearly, we have the mind of Christ. In other words, we have access to the same mind that Christ Jesus had access to through his understanding of his relationship to God. Mrs. Eddy, she describes the Christ in a couple of ways, but the two ways that I liked as a newcomer were this. The first way describes how the Christ appears at the time of physical healing. She says this: Christ, the divine manifestation of God, which comes to the flesh to destroy incarnate error. So that's what happens at the time of physical healing, yes? But also she describes the way the Christ appears in our thinking. She says this: Christ is the true idea voicing good, the divine message from God to men speaking to the human consciousness. I'll say that again. Christ is the true idea voicing good, the divine message from God to men speaking to the human consciousness. This was starting to show to me that as a newcomer to the Bible, I had no experience of Bible knowledge prior to this healing. And then I started studying the weekly Bible lessons from the local Christian Science church. I started attending their Sunday services, their Wednesday testimony meetings. I was hearing people sharing accounts of how they themselves had faced tremendous challenges in their lives, had learned to pray this way in Christian Science, had experienced for themselves the presence of the power of God as one of those laws of life or truth or love, and found themselves suddenly well. In fact, the last 100 pages of this book is a chapter called Fruitage. And every page, they are written accounts, all verified healings of people just like you and I, who came in contact with tremendous trials or sometimes sudden accidents. They learned to pray this way. The result was healing. Mrs. Eddy was discovering for herself and then sharing with as many people as possible that if we can put off this material view of ourselves according to the 5 material senses, and if we can accept more of a spiritual view, as described in 1 Genesis, God made man in his image and likeness, if we can accept more of that spiritual view, the result can be healing. Now, I couldn't contain my enthusiasm for each week's Bible lesson, I must say, because every week the Bible lesson gives you a different subject related to the nature of God for 1 week of study. And so I'm learning something new every week about God from the Bible, and then I'm learning from Science and Health how to apply that in my daily life. So I was really quite enthusiastic about it, although I still had a couple of heavy weights I was carrying, some doubts. And one of the doubts was this: we kept being told in the weekly Bible lesson that God makes man in his image and likeness, and man reflects God. Now, my understanding at that time of reflection just worked the same way that a mirror works, yes? You stand in front of a mirror, your image and likeness appears across the room. That's my understanding of reflection at the time. What I was struggling with was the idea that I've got 3 brothers that are all different shapes and sizes to me. So if we all stood in front of a mirror, which one would God look like, the tall one or the small one? I found it quite puzzling. Until one morning, I'm thinking about this deeply. I don't think I'm going to find the answer when I hear this voice very clearly say to me, Philip, you're standing in the wrong place. You need to back up onto that mirror. You're my image and likeness. Now, this really grabbed my attention because before that point, I'd been thinking of an image and likeness like this. I'm wearing a blue shirt. Imagine that white wall there has got a mirror on it. So if I turn and face that mirror, I'm the original. My image and likeness must reflect back the same as the original, yes? So if I've got a blue short sleeve shirt, turn to face the wall, the mirror has to reflect a blue short sleeve shirt, yes? That's how I thought image and likeness worked. Now I was hearing that God wanted me to consider myself as being his reflection. So now I back up onto the mirror. So here I am now on the mirror, and I'm starting to consider what God is in front of me. Because I knew already from the first couple of weeks of Bible lessons that God is infinite life and spirit and truth and love. And as I was thinking about that, it started to dawn on me that I couldn't imagine God having arthritis 30 odd years ago. So therefore, his image and likeness couldn't have really reflected it. I also couldn't imagine God having one leg shorter than the other. So his image and likeness couldn't have really reflected it. It started to dawn on me that if the original contains certain qualities, the image and likeness must reflect those qualities. But conversely, if something does not appear in the original, it cannot appear in the reflection, can it? For instance, if I'm not wearing a hat, I stand here, I face that mirror, I'm not wearing a hat, the image and likeness cannot reflect a hat back, can it? I wave at the mirror, the image and likeness has no choice. The image and likeness has to wave back. In fact, I used to carry a 50-pound suitcase with me when I was traveling around the country giving these lectures. And as I lifted the 50-pound suitcase onto the check-in desk in St. Louis Airport, there was a plate glass window across the room and I could see my reflection. So I'm lifting a 50-pound suitcase, I'm huffing and puffing. The image and likeness just did it effortlessly. Why? First of all, how heavy was the suitcase in the reflection? 0. How much work was the image and likeness doing? 0. The original was doing all the work. The image and likeness was able to copy instantly, effortlessly. This became a really pivotal point in my understanding of God and how God appears in our lives. Because God is described as being the source of every man, woman, and child. He created all of us in his image and likeness. So when I was thinking of myself being on this mirror and how thrilling a prospect that was to think that I could reflect God's qualities, I was also able to think of, first of all, those people in my village that had caused me terrible bullying as a child, those ones that called themselves Christians. I was now able to realize, well, if God made them in his image and likeness, and if God wasn't a bully, they couldn't really have reflected bullying. And so I was able to release a decades-old resentment for those people from the past. A long-held hurt just evaporated. But then also, I was able to think of all of my loved ones. I'm separated by many loved ones at the moment. Some of them I haven't seen for years because of the lockdown. We were due to travel and visit family and friends this year, having been away from them already for a year. Now we've been away from them for almost 2 years. I was able to include them with me because if God made them in his image and likeness, we must also exist on the same plane of reflection. We are his image and likeness. We must still exist in that same spirit of life, truth, and love that we live and move and have our being in. Just like the radio waves, these radio waves will be passing through all my loved ones. Undetected by the 5 material senses, yes, but these radio waves will be passing through them as much as it'll pass through those old enemies that I learned to forgive. The radio waves don't judge. They're a law, and they just appear unconditionally. Well, how much more then are these laws of life, truth, and love appearing unconditionally amongst all my loved ones that I've been separated from now due to the coronavirus? It became a very liberating experience then, and I'm still finding it to be very liberating right now. This also became a really pivotal experience when About 10 years after the lecture that healed me, I was now working in the prison service in Los Angeles, taking Christian Science Bible lessons in on a Friday night. We had what some of you may remember this. In 2009, we had what was called the swine flu pandemic. And the prison service contacted myself and the other chaplain and said, you don't have to come in this weekend. The prison's on lockdown because we've got that virus in the prison population. So this other prison chaplain and myself, we both learned to pray this way. We knew that God created man in his image and likeness. And we knew, well, if we can't imagine God as having a viral attack, we can't imagine his image and likeness suffering from one either. So we held this thought and this prayer, not just about ourselves, but about the inmates at the prison and the prison officers. We volunteered to go into the prison as usual. They said, yes, as long as you sign some legal disclaimers. We did that and we went to the jail. When we went to the prison, we probably had 3 times as many men as usual turning up for our service because all the other prison volunteers had stayed away because of this pandemic. While we were there, we saw no signs nor sounds of any of the symptoms of that pandemic. When we left the jail, we didn't see any signs nor sounds in any of the prison officers on duty. And in the days and weeks after we went to that prison, we didn't see any sights nor sounds of those symptoms in us either. We were basing our confidence not on some wishful thinking or positive affirmation work or anything. We were basing it on rock solid Bible promises of laws, not human opinions that change, laws that never change, from everlasting to everlasting. This is just one of the passages that I found particularly helpful at that time. Psalm 91. He that dwelleth in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty. I will say of the Lord, he is my refuge and my fortress. My God, in him will I trust. Because thou hast made the Lord, which is my refuge, even the Most High, thy habitation, there shall no evil befall thee, neither shall any plague come nigh thy dwelling. For he shall give his angels charge over thee to keep thee in all thy ways. Passages similar to this from the Bible and the explanation as to how to apply them practically in your daily life from the Christian Science textbook, Science and Health, became a rock for me to build on every week in learning that if I think about myself as purely material, I seem to be limited to what the material senses and my material capacities are capable of doing. If I change that view of myself to a spiritual view and accept what the Bible is trying to say, that we are made in God's image and likeness, there's no material element in that. And therefore there's no material start point or finish point. There's no full tank and empty tank in spirit. Because when you think about what spirit is and what man is by reflection, I'll give you an example. If we think about the spirit of life, truth, and love over this side of the room, and his image and likeness across the room is man, that's every man, woman, and child. When the original is here and an image and likeness appears across the room, let's imagine there are 1,000 threads in this shirt. For this shirt to appear across the room on the mirror, have any of these threads had to rush across the room? No. So the substance of the original remains intact, but a perfect image and likeness appears. Now, if God is the substance, if God is the original, and the substance of God is infinite spirit, life and truth and love, if that is there, God's spirit, and we are God's image and likeness, God doesn't have to rush into our bodies to make us able to reflect those qualities. All we need to do is to understand what God is and lay claim to this understanding consciously. Remember what spiritual sense is? Mrs. Eddy describes it. It's a conscious, constant capacity to understand God. And the Bible tells us God, in him we live and move and have our being. So when we understand that these laws are ever present and fully operational, they then become of great use to us. If we are not conscious of these laws, like with the radio waves, you were not conscious of them until I switched the radio on. Think of mathematics, for instance. I wasn't conscious that 2 + 2 = 4. For the first few days of my maths homework, my homework was wrong. By the end of the week, because my math teacher stuck at it with me, I agreed with the law in maths that 2 + 2 = 4, and my homework got a green check and it took off in a much better direction. But in the days leading up to that, the law of mathematics was there, wasn't it, to help me? But because I wasn't conscious of it, it had no benefit to me at all. When I became conscious of that law in mathematics, it helped me tremendously. What started to dawn on me, the similarities about what happened on the night of the lecture. Even though those laws of life, truth, and love, the laws of God, had been promised from everlasting to everlasting, they were prophesied and produced in the life and times of Christ Jesus. Mrs. Eddy discovers in 1866 that those laws are still fully operational. But while I was not conscious of them, they didn't seem to help me at all. Then on the night of the lecture, I became conscious of this constant capacity to understand God. I get a new view of God as the presence of love that completely flooded my consciousness and my body. I suddenly rose up well. It completely transformed my well-being from that day to this. And yet I was a newcomer. I'd never studied the Bible. Go to the opposite end of the scale of Bible students. You'll find Mrs. Eddy, who always studied the Bible. We're at polar opposites here. She gets a new view of God in 1866. The effect on her well-being completely transformed her well-being when she experienced God as love on that eventful night. This shows me that it doesn't matter which end of the scale you're on, because the laws of God are unconditional. It doesn't matter whether you're a lifelong student who's always studied or a brand new student who's never studied. These laws are available to each and every one of us because they are constants. This became such an incredible help to me because not only was I able to pray for myself this way, but as evidenced in that prison population that we visited, I was now able to pray for other people that I thought about, because I could start identifying them as the image and likeness of God on this reflecting plane, if you like, on the mirror. We were God's image and likeness, made in the image and likeness of an infinite spirit of life, truth, and love. And if I couldn't imagine disease, if I couldn't imagine immoral behavior as coming from God, it couldn't appear in the reflection, could it? And this was quite a tremendous introduction to the practice of Christian Science for myself. And I'm so grateful that the churches spend so much time and effort trying to share this message with the world. I was still struggling with one thing though. I still couldn't get over what had happened to all of those symptoms on the night of the lecture. I mean, I'd been tested and x-rayed and examined over years to get this certificate issued to me. And yet it seemed like they disappeared in the twinkling of an eye. And where do you think I found my answer? It's no surprise. I found it in that week's Bible lesson that I was studying at that time. And the Bible lesson started with a quote from the Bible. I'll share it with you now. It's Jesus quoted in John saying, "Ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." Now, the truth that Jesus was talking about, it's not just a mundane truth like 2 + 2 = 4, as useful as that is. He was talking about the spiritual truth of our spiritual identity made in God's image and likeness, yes? So when you know the truth about that, the truth makes you free. That's what Jesus promised. Mrs. Eddy describes it like this. She says, consciousness constructs a better body when faith in matter has been conquered. Correct material belief by spiritual understanding, and spirit will form you anew. Let me just break that down into a couple of bite-sized chunks, if you don't mind. She says, correct material belief. These are very strongly held material beliefs, which say that this person standing in front of you, permanently physically handicapped, should have died 20 years ago. Very strongly held material beliefs, but not spiritual laws, are they? They're just human beliefs. Mrs. Eddy says, correct material belief by spiritual understanding, maybe symbolized by the radio, if you don't mind. The radio, which symbolizes that spiritual sense, which is above the 5 material senses. Spiritual sense is a conscious, constant capacity to understand God, in whom we live and move and have our being. That mind of Christ that we are told in the Bible we have access to. That Christ that Mrs. Eddy describes in part, she says, it's the true idea voicing good, the divine message from God to men speaking to the human consciousness. This is starting to sound like an inside job, I'm sure you'll agree. Correct material belief by spiritual understanding, and spirit will form you anew. Just like the dish sponge. Remember I described that experience, that terrified little boy? The grip of fear, when it was released, it felt like I just popped back into shape. Then 30 years later, I walk away from that lecture, it felt like I just popped back into shape. This became such a logical explanation to what was going on in my healing experience, but also according to the last 100 pages of this book, according to all the testimony meetings being shared around the world on a Wednesday night, and according to hundreds of thousands of recent testimonies that have been written up in the 2 Christian Science magazines. One is a monthly magazine called the Christian Science Journal. The other is a weekly called the Christian Science Sentinel. They devote the last few pages to every single edition that have been published for over 140 years. Every single edition includes current healing testimonies from people just like you and I, who faced all kinds of really big or sometimes small challenges. They learned to pray this way. The result was healing. If I had any more doubts about the presence of these laws of love, the presence of these laws of health and well-being, and how effective they can be when understood consciously, Mrs. Eddy, in that same week's Bible lesson I was studying about 20 years ago, Mrs. Eddy had another passage in there which completely blew my doubts out of the water. She asks this question. She says, if sickness is real, it belongs to immortality. If true, it is a part of truth. Would you attempt with drugs or without to destroy a quality or condition of truth? Think about this for a moment. Think about a simple truth like 2 + 2 = 4, right? It's 4 today. Because it's true today, it must have been true 1,000 years ago, and therefore it will be true in another 1,000 years, yes? It's a law, right? That's what the truth is. It doesn't change. Mrs. Eddy is saying, if sickness is true, it belongs to truth. In other words, it's constant, it's eternal. Would you attempt with drugs or without to destroy a quality or condition of truth? Can you change 2 + 2 from making 4 by pouring medicine on it, or surgically operating on it? Or could you give it counseling and say, we don't mind if you want to be 3 or if you want to be 5? No. 2 + 2 = 4 is a fixed fact. It's a law, and it'll never change. It's a part of truth. Here, Mrs. Eddy is saying, if sickness is true, would you try to change it? Then she says, but if sickness and sin are illusions, the awakening from this mortal dream or illusion will bring us into health, holiness, and immortality. This is the salvation which comes through God, the divine principle, love, as demonstrated by Jesus. Remember, Jesus was called Jesus the Christ, or Christ Jesus, because Jesus reflected that infinite source of love, that Christly love, into everything that he did. But he got it from his heavenly Father. He knew that he was made in his image and likeness. He could then reflect it into every situation he went into. This law of love had been promised from the beginning of the Bible all the way through to be everlasting and ever present. Some prophets were able to produce it. There were certain healings in the Old Testament, but they were sporadic. When Christ Jesus came and started his healing ministry, he healed with repeated similar effect by transforming the whole landscape of that person's life through the laws of love. Then for 1900 years, it seems to have been forgotten, yes. But Mrs. Eddy discovered in 1866 that those laws were still fully present and fully operational. And now she was writing about them and sharing them through the work of the Christian Science churches, the Christian Science reading rooms, and the Christian Science magazines. And they were going out all around the world. This became such a logical and inspiring study for me. Logical because it was making perfect sense. The more I understood to be true about the original, the more I could accept as being true for the image and likeness. And it was so logical and so unconditional. It played out in a beautiful way in a healing that my younger brother had. He had a dreadful fall off a bike one day. Completely broke this arm. You could see it. When he walked into the house, you could see his arm was broken. And he said to me, "I'm in agony, take me to the hospital." I agreed to take him to the hospital, but I also offered to pray for him this way, the way that we pray in Christian Science, which is quietening the 5 material senses and tune into spiritual sense to see what God might have to say to our human consciousness. Well, if you'd seen my brother's response, he was an atheist. He did not believe in God at that time. He nearly flipped out. He went, "No, I don't want prayer. Look at this. I want anesthetic and surgery. Get me to the hospital." Okay, I said, so I drove him to the hospital. When we got there, accident and emergency department x-rayed him and confirmed it was a particularly bad break. And they said, "Look, this is so bad, you'll be in plaster for a lot longer than usual, which means you'll also lose the use of all of those muscles. So even when the plaster comes off, you're going to have a good few months of physical therapy to get the use of that hand back." My brother's heart sinks because he was due to sit the finals for his degree in just a couple of weeks' time, and he needed that hand. So my brother's heart sinks at this news. Then the doctor delivered him a body blow. He said, "Look, Mr. Hockley, it's almost 9:30 p.m. on Good Friday." Now that's a 4-day holiday in the United Kingdom. He said the fracture clinic closed at 5 p.m. and doesn't reopen until 8 a.m. on Tuesday morning. So I can't put you in a plaster cast tonight. But what I'll do, he said, is I'll strap you very securely to your chest and I'll give you whopping great big painkillers. He said, "You won't feel a thing." Well, my brother's color drained when he realized he's now going to have to sleep on an unprotected arm for 4 nights. And while the doctor was writing out the prescription for that medication, my brother turned to me rather sheepishly and said, "Hey, Philip, is prayer still an option?" He may as well have asked me, "Are radio waves in this room?" What do you think I said? Yes, I said, prayer is still an option. So we were driving home, and it's about a 10, maybe 15-minute drive. I talked to him about image and likeness, how God made man in his image and likeness, and my brother readily accepted this. He, at the time, had been a nightclub DJ in his spare time to pay for his college course. So he used to spend sometimes a couple of hours in the mirror, checking himself out, making sure that his clothes and his hair were perfect before he went out on stage in the night. So he knew what a reflection looked like until we get back to the family home. And I said, "Remember, God made us as his image and likeness." I said, "Now we've got to back up onto the mirror. We are his reflection." So my brother is standing there with me now, and I made him back up onto the mirror and think about what God is. And we talked about God as being infinite life and truth and love. So as my brother's thinking about God in front of himself, and then looking down at this arm, then looking up into the space in front, he started chuckling to himself, and he said, "Don't be so ridiculous," he said. "God couldn't fall off a bike." And then he said, "And God couldn't have a broken arm like this." He started laughing. He then said, "I'm off to bed." He took himself off to bed. I didn't see him until breakfast time. When I saw him at breakfast time, he walked into the room and he said, "Look," he said, "I'm in no pain. All the swelling is gone, but I still want to go to the hospital." I said, "Fine, I'll take you to the hospital on Tuesday." But I tidied up the loose bandages. Everything that we had talked about now, coming home from the hospital, was related to his spiritual identity, right? We talked about God making man in his image and likeness. When we get to the hospital on Tuesday, the fracture clinic rather wisely said, we'll take an x-ray in case things have changed since Friday. They take an x-ray. The doctor puts the x-ray up on the light box and he said this. He said, look, Mr. Hockley, who told you you have a broken arm? And my brother said, well, on Friday, accident and emergency did. So he now brings Friday's image. 2 images are up on the light box now. So he points to Friday's image and he said this. Look, Mr. Hockley, he said, on Friday, I can see you had a broken arm. What was the doctor seeing with? Wasn't it one of his 5 material senses? Yes. In fact, I was there on Friday. When my brother came into the house, my material senses showed me that he had a badly broken arm. I could see it with my eyes. But when I saw that, and it was a shocking picture, I reverted to prayer with spiritual sense straight away. And I went straight to my spiritual sense and I said, Father, what do you see, God? What do you see? And I was ready to listen. And what I heard, the divine message from God to man, if you like, what I heard was, I have not fallen today, neither has my image and likeness. Now that was referring to my brother as his image and likeness. And I clung to those few words like a drowning man at sea, holding on to a life raft. I clung to those words from that prayer all the way through the hospital experience until I got home with my brother. So now on Tuesday, the doctor is saying, well, on Friday, he said, Friday's image, I can see you had a broken arm. But today, he said, I can't see a broken arm. He said, can you do some tests for me? Can you stretch out your arm without pain? My brother stretched out his arm without pain. He said, can you clench your fist back and forth without pain? My brother was able to clench his fist back and forth, no pain. The doctor said, now I can conclude from my tests and examinations, you don't have a broken arm. He said, you're free to go. Now, we left that hospital rejoicing for sure. My brother did sit and pass those finals just a few weeks later using that hand. But more importantly, this became a life-changing experience in my brother's life. He became a changed man from that night onwards. And when I talked to him in more detail about it, he said this, he said, when the doctor said I'm going to have to sleep on an unprotected arm with just a bandage on, he said, I was terrified. He said, I couldn't imagine, rolling over in my sleep. The pain, he said, would have been awful. Then he said, you made me do that image and likeness example in the house where God was in front and we were on the mirror. And I saw that God, if God hasn't got a bike and fallen off it, well, I couldn't have by reflection. He said, I felt a strange sense of being comforted. And I went to bed and I just lay down and slept like a baby. He said, I forgot about the broken arm altogether. When he used that word comforted, it reminded me of a beautiful concept I'd heard about while studying one of these weekly Bible lessons from the Christian Science Quarterly. That Bible lesson was focused on the quality and the nature of Christ Jesus. And at the end of Jesus's healing ministry, he says, I am going to pray the Father that he will send you another comforter, and this comforter will stay with you throughout all time. My brother, as a complete atheist, in a moment of absolute desperation, he was at his lowest ebb and terrified, ready for anything to help. He experienced the presence of God in his life, a new view of God in the quality of the comfort that he felt. This comfort allowed my brother's life to be completely transformed in that instant. He no longer had a broken arm and he'd never studied the Bible. What a change on his well-being that was. Remember, fast forward right up to Mrs. Eddy's time of her Bible studies. She'd studied the Bible her entire life. Yet she gets a new view of God as the presence of love that completely transforms her well-being, changed her life forever. My brother had never picked up the Bible. Mrs. Eddy had always picked up the Bible. Both of them experienced a new view of God in the presence of those qualities that have such a healing effect. Why? Because those qualities are based on laws. Those laws are ever present, fully operational, and as unconditional as these radio waves. They don't care where you are on the scale of Bible studies. They don't care whether you're male or female, rich or poor, young or old. These radio waves are just going to pass through every part of you. In the same way, how much more are those laws, divine laws of life, truth, and love, ever present, going to be passing through every brick and beam of the buildings, every fiber of our bodies, ready to help restore us when we become conscious of this constant capacity, remember. If we're not conscious of the laws, like in maths, 2 + 2 did not make sense to me, but the law of 2 + 2 in maths was there for me, wasn't it? Yes? I just wasn't conscious of it. If we are not conscious of the laws of divine life, truth, and love, it can seem like they're not there. I know. I experienced that for 35 years. But now that I learned to pray this way in Christian Science, I can now become conscious of this constant capacity to understand God, in whom we live and move and have our being. That's the message of these lectures. That's the message of the weekly Bible lessons in the Christian Science Quarterly. It's the message of all the Christian Science churches around the world, is that all of us can rely on an ever-present help. Even if you've been told you're a hopeless case, and like me, I tried every known human, every single human remedy, and still I was told I was hopeless. Christian Science proved that to be not the case. If you've been told you're incurable, I was told I was incurable. Christian Science has proved that that's not necessarily so. Because Christian Science is based on laws, divine laws which never change, ever present, and fully operational. If any of these ideas have appealed to you today about how these laws appear everywhere in our lives, you can reach out on the contact page after this lecture and try, if you like, getting this book and trying it for yourself. You can visit the church website. You can do all of these things for yourself, because it's not just what I'm saying, it's because God has put those laws in your hearts and your minds. God has given you access to that mind of Christ. You have that spiritual sense, which is a conscious, constant capacity to understand God. That spiritual sense, like the Christ in you, that Christ, which is the divine message from God to men, speaking to our human consciousness. Oh, this is definitely an inside job, in my opinion, now. And I love learning to pray and practice this way as often as I can now. This is something that's open to each and every one of us because it's a gift from God. God, who made each and every one of us in his image and likeness. All we're being asked to do is to become conscious of this. If these ideas have been helpful, I strongly recommend you try them for yourselves. Don't just take my word for it. Reach out to the church after this lecture if you'd like a copy of the textbook. Try and get hold of the same weekly Bible lessons that we're studying every week around the world. A new subject every week introduces me to new qualities about God, which I can learn. If they're true for God, they must be true about his image and likeness. That means all my so-called enemies that I can now learn to forgive, but also my loved ones that I seem to be separated from. I think these messages are vitally important at any time. But at this particular time in human history, oh my goodness, these messages are so comforting, so supportive. I, along with the church that sponsored the lecture, really wish that you will experience some of that comfort for yourself. Thank you so much for spending this time with us today, and be blessed in everything you do. Thank you.